Tim, Josh, thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here, and can I say on behalf of QASMI what a privilege it is to be engaged in the discussions today. QASMI, as Josh mentioned, is the Centre for the Advancement of Sustainable Medical Innovation, a joint institute between UCL and Oxford, and that jointness, I think, reflects the scale of the challenges we're all trying to address, which require not only interdisciplinary endeavour but interinstitutional endeavour to get sufficient minds together to move this agenda forward. The common stimulus for Oxford and for UCL behind the formation of QASMI reflected, I think, a collective concern that despite unprecedented scientific advance in recent years, exploiting that scientific advance for public good to meet unmet clinical need was perceived to be faltering, and much needed to be done to address that. That assertion was heralded by the social historian Roy Porter almost 20 years ago, who, as you see here, said that the expectations of medicines were becoming unlimited, and medicine will have to redefine its limits even as it extends its scientific capacity. And the reason for these concerns has many contributing factors, but perhaps the most important is that, as you're all aware, healthcare costs in most developed countries are escalating to unsustainable levels, hence the sustainable word in the QASMI title. There are many contributors to that unsustainable position: an ageing population, the rising prevalence of chronic disease, increased public expectation demanding more of health systems. But it's this last factor which perhaps is one of most concern in relationship to today's agenda, and it's the diffusion of technologies, new medical technologies of marginal incremental benefit that is a major cost driver in many of these health systems. Now, clearly, I'm not arguing that we should stop innovating to reduce that cost. What we should do is innovate better, smarter, faster to achieve genuine healthcare value, that is incremental benefit, more health outcome for every pound or dollar that is spent within a health system. And yet we know there is huge unmet clinical need, so the need for medical innovation remains. Cancer, we've just been hearing about where we are in precision medicine or personalised medicine in the cancer field, and yet cancer is increasing in prevalence. It's estimated now that 1 in 2 of our population will develop cancer at some point in their lifetime. There's the unmet burden of mental health in most societies around the world, with really no new drugs for the last couple of decades in that field. Rare diseases, which collectively account for more illness than does cancer in this country, some 3.5 million people affected by rare diseases, depending on which way you define it. And the burden of neurodegenerative disease, particularly dementia, because of the ageing of the population. Antimicrobial resistance, I could go on, but the point I'm making is that we simply can't stop innovating in the face of this growing tide of unmet clinical need. And as we've heard, there is the promise that if we could target better, we would increase clinical effectiveness, and perhaps if we could intervene earlier, we might improve cost effectiveness by removing downstream costs. The position that QASMI has taken on these issues is that if we are to improve the process of medical innovation, we have to recognise that the answer is not solely in the hands of the biomedical scientists. There's a tendency for science to think if we simply push the answers out there, then the solution is apparent. Rather, we view the medical innovation process as a holistically and as a circular process, which requires multiple disciplines to address the challenges at any particular point on that circle. And rather than give you theory, I thought it might be better to refer to my own experience as a diabetologist and just illustrate some of the steps in this chain and how the hype, the hope, the promise of precision medicine or personalised medicine plays out. And I deliberately start with the issue of patient need because it's my firm contention that unless we start from that point, we're going to invent the wrong solutions. Let me illustrate that, as I say, with reference to diabetes. So in the early 1920s, insulin was discovered by Banting and Best. And the picture you can see here is one of the first children to be treated for what before the discovery of insulin was a fatal disease. 3 months later, you can see her restored to normal weight, recovered because of injections of soluble insulin. Injections had to be given with devices such as this. And in the 30s and 40s, the medical scientists thought, well, this is not a very satisfactory way to treat the condition because you have to inject every time you eat a meal. So 3 or 4 times a day, patients would be subjecting themselves to injections. And so the concept of once a day insulin came up by linking soluble insulin to protamine and zinc and other things to slow up its absorption to avoid multiple injections. The net result of that, and the sort of thing I observed when I was training as a diabetes specialist, was firstly very poor control of blood sugar because the insulin didn't match the food. It was a slug of insulin which would last all day. Before meal, night time, and completely unpredictable hypoglycemia, which could push the person into a coma. And the need for the patient to adopt rigid mealtime adherence. So 12 o'clock, sorry, I've got to leave, I've got to go and eat my meal. And what, of course, the invention of long-acting insulin failed to appreciate is what really matters to patients. And if you ask people with diabetes what really matters to them, it's being like you and me. It's being normal, it's being in control, that is not subject to hypoglycemia, falling down in public, being confused with being drunk, and not to have to eat when others are not, distinguishing yourself from your peers. And those issues far outweigh the inconvenience, the perceived inconvenience and discomfort of multiple injections. And that realization made me realize that we really must think of what matters to the individual when we design our treatments. And there are still drugs and treatments being developed which don't have that issue at the front of mind. So what about the hope and its realization? Well, here I'm going to use an example which is, in a sense, about science. Exquisite life science, fundamental science performed here in Oxford by Fran Ashcroft, which was the discovery that a particular potassium ATP channel in the pancreas is important for the control of insulin release. Now, working with my colleague Andrew Hattersley at the time in Exeter, Fran evolved this idea that so-called monogenic neonatal diabetes, that's diabetes within the first few months of life, was due to a mutation in this channel. And they were able to show this in population studies and accounted for the majority of neonatal diabetes. Now, the beauty of the association between basic science and clinical science meant that they were also able to demonstrate that that channel deficit caused by the mutation could be corrected with the use of an existing drug, a sulfonylurea, a drug that is used to treat, in fact, later onset diabetes. And within a few months, they were able to demonstrate that these children who had previously always been treated with insulin because it was assumed they were young people, they needed insulin, like the girl in the picture I showed, could be treated with a tablet. And not only could they be treated, but the control of their blood sugar was much better because the deficit, the specific molecular deficit, was corrected. And the remarkable thing about this set of discoveries that within some 18 months, the loop had been closed from proof of concept to meeting unmet need, with hundreds of people around the world being treated for this particular condition. So a wonderful example that I think deserves a bit of hype, but does tend to raise expectations for the rest of the agenda. And I would concur with Tim that the hype can easily get ahead of the reality. I think it was last week that there was, or maybe this week, the NHS Innovation Expo meeting. This was one of the flyers. Innovation is creating the wonder of personalised medicine. Well, in the context I've just mentioned, of course, it is wonderful. I should say that this was not Sue Hill's quote. Her name was just positioned near it. Sue is a highly responsible chief scientist for the NHS who has, in my view, a very rational view of the position of personalised medicine and the challenges of implementing it in practice. The pitfalls are considerable. We've heard the genetic challenges or the mutational challenges that exist within the cancer field. The same, to a certain extent, is true in my field of diabetes, where a recent publication in The Lancet reveals just how challenging the genetics of common type 2 diabetes is. We only know about 10% of the mutations responsible for the genetic contribution to diabetes. Diabetes does run quite heavily in families. And the problem is that the genetic contribution in a huge study involving over 100,000 people with diabetes and normal subjects revealed that there aren't many rare diseases contributing to this. It's small effects of multiple common diseases. That makes it very, very difficult to target anything of consequence and achieve the sorts of results I showed you for neonatal diabetes, where there's a specific single gene defect. So what is the practical reality? Well, when I was president of the Academy of Medical Sciences, we worked with NHS England and Sue Hill to start a programme of looking at common diseases and how we could demonstrate that a stratified approach to that condition could be brought to bear within an NHS environment. It's been stated that introducing precision medicine to a cash-strapped NHS is not very different from sticking a rocket engine onto a Model T Ford and expecting it to go down the motorway. And that, of course, is the challenge, because if you present to hard-pressed NHS institutions, put this into practice when new cancer drugs are extremely expensive, then you can imagine some of the challenges that that presents. It was, I think, said by Josh that in a sense, personalised medicine is not new. All doctors, I think, would maintain that they try and deliver personalised medicine. I think that's an important message to get across to people, that the scientific tools are simply enabling us to potentially refine that approach. But also, it doesn't have to be expensive, because, as I mentioned in relationship to diabetes, treating that particular monogenic form of diabetes is actually cheaper to do it properly with a sulfonylurea than lifelong insulin injections. And of course, I won't go through this, but we were able to come up with draft clinical pathways to stratify all forms of diabetes, not just dependent on genetic testing. In fact, genetic testing only forms part of this protocol if other conditions are fulfilled. But by following a schema such as this, it's more likely that the right patient is classified in the right way and therefore gets the most appropriate extant treatment for their condition. So the final barrier, my final point, I suppose, is that going round the circle and fulfilling unmet need clearly depends on people taking the treatment that has been developed, this adoption process. And again, referring to diabetes, it staggered me when I was heavily involved in running diabetes services, just how low adherence was, even to in insulin-dependent diabetes. And remember, insulin is necessary to sustain life. The mean insulin deficit in a study performed by Andrew Morris in Tayside was 55 days a year. That is, people are taking not taking insulin equivalent to 55 days in any particular year. And of course, poor adherence correlated with poor outcome. And the same is true for those with type 2 diabetes. Roughly 50% of people are taking the treatment as prescribed. And unless we understand that, unless we can address that, part of which I think relates to my first point, that we aren't targeting what matters to individuals, unless we can address that, then all the new science is in vain. I will finish by mentioning a program of work I'm leading for the Academy of Medical Sciences at the moment, stimulated by a very topical issue some of you will have seen in the press today, the case for statins, which is how we as a society or as regulators or as healthcare professionals judge evidence on the benefits and harms of medicines. So big overlap with the agenda that you're considering today. QASMI has a research agenda. These are some of the big issues that we're addressing, so I hope you see synergy of interest here with some of your own particular interests. Understanding perceptions of risk, the process of adherence or lack thereof, understanding the value proposition of medical innovation and reframing that, and then underpinning all of this, what we believe is the need for a new social compact or contract that fully engages society, because as the fourth P of P4 medicine said, without profound participation, we aren't going to achieve the full potential, and we aren't going to negate those assertions by Roy Porter some 2 decades ago. We also need to be alert to the Accelerated Access Review, which is soon to be public. I will end with a promotion. Following this meeting, there will be another meeting in March hosted in UCL, to which everybody here is warmly invited. We will devise a programme in conjunction with colleagues in Oxford so that we can ensure that the topics that are discussed synergise with your interest today. But with that, thank you very much.